Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to your Wednesday geography lesson. I hope that you are all having a good week so far. So I wanted to start by just giving you a little bit of feedback on your Google Forms from last lesson. Firstly, thank you very much to all of you for working so hard to get those completed and submitted on time. There were three kind of common mistakes that seem to be quite common across the board. So I just want to run through and make sure that we learn from these misconceptions. The first one was around which country's word landlocked. Just want to remind you that that phrase landlocked means a country that has no direct access to the sea. In other words, a country that is surrounded by land. And that has quite big disadvantages for countries because it means they find it very difficult to trade and have to rely on those countries around them in order to get access to the sea. The second one was around development indicators and specifically social versus economic indicators. Now, you were all able to tell me appropriate indicators which could be used to measure development, but some of you did get a little bit confused between which ones were social and which ones were economic. Now, these are really important words for you to understand in geography because they come up time and time again for almost every single topic. So when we refer to something being economic, what we mean is it's to do with money or jobs. So in this context, how much money people have or what jobs do they do. So an example would be unemployment or average salary. Anything to do with money or jobs is economic, whereas social is to do with how well do people live. It's anything to do with people and their lives. So in this case, things about life expectancy, healthcare or education will be included in social indicators. And finally, this concept of why it's better to combine development indicators rather than using just one. And the main thing is it's fairer. As you saw from some of the examples I gave you last lesson, if we just look at one development indicator, it can give us a misleading impression of a country. So if we use more than one indicator, it gives us a much fairer and more accurate impression. It also tells us what is the government of that country doing with the money that it has. You could have a situation where you had a very rich country, but it didn't actually use that money to improve the lives of the people. So that would therefore not be a very developed country. So when we combine indicators, for example, through HDI, it makes it much fairer. Okay, so moving on to today's lesson. Our title for today is what are the causes of inequality. So last lesson we saw that we had different types of countries which had different levels of development or different levels of wealth, if we want to be a little bit simpler. Today we're going to try and explore some of the reasons why some countries are richer than others. But we are going to start by doing our retrieval. For your retrieval today, I would please like you to just do your answers in note form on either a piece of paper or in your red exercise book. Remember, note form means just short answers. You don't need to do full sentences. There are 7 questions on the board for you, so what I would like you to do now is just take a pause, answer those 7 questions in your book for your retrieval, and once you are finished, you can play the video again and we'll check our answers. Okay, so the answers are on the board now for you to check and green pen. Remember, you might not have written exactly the same thing as I have written on the board, but do please just check through and make sure that you're roughly correct. The one in particular, just make sure that you have got accurate, is that number 3, name one economic development indicator. So you could have had anything to do with money or jobs. So I've given a few examples there. If you've written something different, but it is to do with the money or the jobs within the country, then that will be fine. And for number 5, 6, and 7, a reminder that in your retrieval, we are continually going to be going back to topics we've done earlier in the year just to make sure that you are keeping that information at the front of your memory. So once again, just take a pause of the video if you need to check your answers and correct anything in green pen. Once you are ready, then play the video again and we will move on with today's lesson. Okay, so as I said, today's lesson is all about the causes of inequality. So I want us to just spend a minute or so just making sure we are happy with this concept of inequality. Inequality basically means differences, things not being the same. In maths, you would have looked at the term inequality to mean different sides of an equation being different, so numbers not being equal. In this context, in geography, we tend to mean the amount of wealth within a country or the level of development in a country or an area not being equal. So different people, either different groups or different parts of the country or different countries themselves, having different levels of development. And we started to look at that last lesson because we saw that in the world we have our HICs, high income countries, LICs, low income countries, and also newly emerging economies or NEEs. So around the world, wealth is not evenly spread. Not all countries have the same level of development, and we call that inequality. But the other thing to make sure you've recognised is that we do see differences between countries. We have some rich countries, some poor countries, but also we can see inequality within countries. If you take just one country, even our country, the UK, there are inequalities, there are differences in wealth and differences of development even within one country. So some areas being richer than others. So what I would like you to do, if you need reminding, if you're not quite confident with those three key words, high income country, low income country, and newly emerging economy, I'd like you to get those written down again, because by writing them down, that will help cement them into your brain. So do that, please, if you can't remember those words. Once you've done that, I would then like you, once again, note form answers is fine, in your red book to answer the reflection questions. Firstly, what kind of inequalities might you find between HICs and LICs? If you were to go to those two different countries, what kind of differences might you see? Have a think about some of those development indicators we looked at last lesson. For example, what differences might you see in the wealth? What differences you might see in the life expectancy, and so on and so forth. And for your second question, sorry, that should say a number 2. Can you think of any examples of inequalities within our own society? Think about within our country or even within Oxford itself. Are there any inequalities that you can see evidence for? So once again, just take a couple of minutes, get some note form answers in your book. Once you've done that and you're happy and you're ready, please move on. But whilst you're doing your questions, just pause the video, and then when you're ready, play again, and we'll move on to the next activity. Okay, so hopefully you have quite a few different pieces of evidence of inequality that you might see both between countries and also within a country. So one really simple example would be levels of income. LICs, people would have lower paid jobs perhaps compared to an HIC or a richer country, but we also see differences in terms of the quality of life. So the type of healthcare or the quality of healthcare available, the amount of education available, and so on. So what we're going to do for the rest of the lesson is have a look at the causes of inequality. What I mean by this is we're going to start to explore, and this is a really big topic, so we're not going to be able to really delve into it, but we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about some of the different reasons why there is inequality. Why is it that some countries are richer than others? You are going to need to get a version of this table drawn into your book. Please make sure that you have plenty of space to write some notes, because as I'm talking with the video, you are going to be filling in this table. So once again, pause the video for me, draw a copy of this table, making sure that you've got plenty of space to write notes in each of the boxes. I have defined at the top of in the second row of the table, you've got the definitions of what economic, social, environmental, and political mean. Please write those in as well. So pause the video, get that written down, and then when you have finished, restart the video and we will have a look at each of these different causes of inequality and see how they can cause some countries to be richer than others. Okay, so we are going to start with environmental inequality. Environmental means to do with the world around us, particularly kind of plants, animals, and the natural environment. So I'm going to write some notes on the screen. As you are listening, I would like you to write a few notes into your table, as well as some examples of countries where these factors are relevant. So just starting off thinking about natural disasters. So natural disasters, remember, are things that happen naturally that cause, so they're natural, but they cause damage for humans. So loads of examples here: floods, earthquakes, droughts. All of these things would be included in natural disasters. Now, it's probably quite obvious, but natural disasters, if you constantly have nature causing you problems within your country, so your land is constantly flooded, or there might be earthquakes or volcanoes, this can cause quite a lot of death in your country, but it also means the government is going to have to spend a lot of money rebuilding the country all the time, and it means that shops, businesses, and other economic activities are going to be damaged. So it's very hard to develop if you have a country that has lots of natural disasters. So it's likely that if a country has lots of natural disasters, that will be an LIC. An example of this is the country of Bangladesh. Sorry, I'm just trying to write on the screen. Which has lots and lots of flooding, and that's one of the big reasons why that country is less developed than it could be, because its land is constantly being flooded. That affects the farmland, but also the businesses within the region as well. We also have natural resources. So natural resources are things that nature gives us that are helpful to humans. So natural resources are helpful. And often, if we have lots of natural resources, NR, natural resources, that can cause countries to be rich. I'm going to explain why that's not always the case later on, but certainly within history, the countries that developed first, such as the UK, are countries that had lots of natural resources. In the UK, some of the resources included wood. We were a country that used to have lots and lots of forests. We also had a lot of coal and also iron ore, which is what we use to make steel, which was very important in the Industrial Revolution. So natural resources can be helpful, particularly they were in the past. Climate. The most developed countries will have a mild climate. Once again, the UK is a good example of that. In the UK, it is neither too hot or too cold. It's kind of just right. And what that means is that we don't get lots of nasty tropical diseases all the time. It also means it is good for growing our crops. So it's quite easy to feed our population. On the other hand, we can In other countries, it can be too hot or too dry. Lots of our countries in sub-Saharan Africa experience that. In a tropical climate, there are often lots of diseases, which makes it hard for a country to develop. And then finally, water supply. So in a very dry climate, there is little water, which means it's hard for people to have enough to drink, but also hard to grow crops. Okay. And examples of countries that experience poor water supply are going to be lots of the countries in Northern Africa, because as you have seen from your work a few lessons ago, the Sahara Desert is the largest desert in the world, and that is in North Africa, so that makes it quite hard for countries to develop. So the environment can either be a good thing or a bad thing. Natural disasters and extreme climate or poor water supply will make it more likely for a country to be an LIC. Having a mild climate, having natural resources, and also safety from natural disasters can be very helpful and would cause a country to be likely to be an HICE. And the UK is a very good example that has lots of these environmental benefits. Okay, so now moving on to economic. Remember, economic means anything to do with money or jobs. So I want to start by just looking at this one down here, that's natural resources. Now, I said to you on the last slide that it was really helpful for a country to have lots of natural resources. Okay, now that is not always the case. It's not always helpful to have lots of natural resources. Okay, and the reason for that is because of unequal trade and exploitation. Unfortunately, what is happening in the world at the moment is that some natural resources have a very low value. Okay, so although you may think that a country has lots of a resource, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, it's a country that has lots of natural resources, but the price that it receives for its natural resources is actually very low. So, although it's got these resources, it doesn't actually make very much money from them. We call that unequal trade. Okay, unequal trade. Lots of people say that these LICs, the poorer countries, don't get a fair price for the resources that they have. The other thing to point out is that some of these natural resources can cause conflict within a country. What I mean by that, conflict essentially means fighting. And what can happen in some countries, and once again, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, is a good example of this, is that people within the country end up fighting over the resources that are there. When there is war and when there is conflict, that is going to cause a country to be less developed. So just to summarise that, although natural resources, as we saw in the last slide, can be helpful, nowadays it can also be a disadvantage. The reason for that is that countries may be given a low value or a low price for their natural resources. They don't receive very much money from them. And secondly, it can cause conflict within a country, and your example there is DRC, or Democratic Republic of Congo. On the other hand, another cause of inequality is investment in technology. Now, this is something that our HICs do very well and causes them to become richer. So once our HICs have a little bit of money, they're then able to spend that money on technology, which turns natural resources into more valuable things. So turns natural resources into more valuable products. Okay, so our HICs have money to start with. Because they've got money, I'm just going to put a little dollar sign there for money, they can therefore invest in new technology. That new technology can then be used to turn natural resources into more valuable products. So they are going to pay low prices to LICs for the natural resources. They then process it, they turn it into something else. Okay, and then they're going to sell high value items. We'll look at this in more detail another day, so don't worry too much if you don't quite understand that. But a really good example here, once again using the Democratic Republic of Congo, they have lots of the natural resources that we use in our mobile phones. So what they do is they mine things like tantalum, which are natural resources. Don't worry too much about what that is. They dig that out of the ground. They then sell it for a relatively low price to the HICs. The HICs then use their technology to process it, and they turn it into mobile phones that they then sell for a much higher price. So the people that are actually benefiting are our HICs. Because they've got money to start with, they can invest in technology, so they then end up getting richer and richer. Okay, our third different area, political causes of inequality. So political causes of inequality means to do with the government. Well, okay, so firstly, let's start with war and conflict. So countries that are experiencing war, it's very hard for them to develop. So they are likely to be LICs, or they are likely to be becoming less developed at the moment. War is very dangerous because obviously just as it is going to kill people and injure people, it also makes it very hard for people to live normal lives and do business while conflict is taking place. So 2 examples of countries that have been really affected by this. So the civil war in Syria at the moment is causing huge problems for development as cities are being bombed, as people are being forced out of their homes. They then can't help themselves make money and support their families. And Iraq and Afghanistan are 2 more countries that have experienced quite a lot of recent conflict, and that has really stopped their development. So that war and conflict in those areas are the key reasons why they are less developed countries. Poor governance and corruption. What I mean by this is governments not running countries well. So obviously the government or the leaders in the country are the main people who are deciding what money is spent on and how the country is run. And there are unfortunately a lot of examples of countries that have so many environmental and social advantages, and yet because they have had governments making poor decisions and also corrupt governments, corrupt means that they are taking the country's money and using it for themselves instead, what has ended up happening is the country has become really poor and less developed, even though it has lots of advantages. Now, a good example of this one is the country of Zimbabwe, which used to be known as the breadbasket of Africa. It's called the breadbasket of Africa because it was able to produce so much food and had so many natural advantages. Now, up until just recently, it was run by a corrupt, very poor president called Robert Mugabe. And as a result of a lot of the decisions he made, the country has ended up actually becoming very undeveloped. It's really become an LIC, and there's actually been cases of food shortages and famine within a country. And that is partly because of the poor decisions they've made and how they've managed the wealth, but also partly to do with corruption, Robert Mugabe, and also his the other ministers within his government taking the country's money, using it for themselves and to become rich themselves rather than helping the country itself. And the last thing I want to touch upon is this concept of colonialism. Colonialism means when one country rules another one. In your first lesson, when you looked at the history of Africa, you will have seen that lots of European countries went to Africa during the 18th and 19th centuries, and they basically took over and used military power in order to run or rule the countries there. What those countries did is the HICs, or the European countries, developed at the expense of others. So the HICs, or the colonial powers, the people from Europe, would have gone to Africa, and they would have taken the resources and taken the benefits from those countries, and those countries would have got richer, whilst the countries in Africa, that were part of the empire, became poorer. So this is another example of exploitation. Some countries getting richer at the expense of others. Some countries getting richer while the other ones get poorer. And this has been a real problem in Africa because of the colonial history. Lots of these countries used to be parts of the French, the British, the Dutch empires, and that meant that they have not benefited from the natural resources, for example, they've had, because those resources were taken out of the country and used to benefit the HICs, or the colonial powers, instead. So this is quite a big problem across Africa due to that colonial history. Okay, and finally, I just want to talk a little bit about these social causes. So social means to do with people. Now, firstly, to talk about the size and density of population. If you have lots of people in one place, okay, that is going to mean it is easier to do business. Okay, it means that lots of people, you can trade more easily with each other, and it's a lot easier to make money. So our countries where there are lots of people there, and also that they live relatively close together, are going to benefit in that way. So China is a good example here of where the huge size of its population, so I think it has 1.3 billion people, has been used really effectively to improve the development within that country and help it to become more developed. And China is now an NEE, a newly emerging economy, and that's because it's used its labour force, its population, to help basically run lots of factories, and that's really driven and improved the economy. And then finally, investment in improving health, education, and housing. So this is to do with the decisions made by governments. So when a country gets some money, the government can then choose how to spend it. Some countries choose to spend it wisely, and a good example of this is Costa Rica. Now, Costa Rica isn't one of the richest countries in the world by any means. It's very much kind of middling in terms of its income. However, the government there has really made a point to invest in improving the health, the education, the housing, the quality of life for people in the country, which means that when you compare it to some countries that on paper are much richer, the standard of living in Costa Rica is actually much higher. So just one example of where you don't have to be the richest country in the world to improve your levels of development. You can also make wise decisions about what you use your income for. Okay, so if you do need to go back and watch any of it again, remember you should have been writing notes into your table. If you need any of that again, just pause, rewind to make sure that you have at least one example for each of the 4 categories, and you've got a couple of notes about how these things may cause inequality. Okay, so your task for today's lesson, to show me that you have understood, is you are going to answer this question for me. Suggest reasons why some countries are more developed than others. I want you to use your learning from today's lesson to answer this question. You should include 2 point evidence explanation paragraphs. Remember, point evidence explanation is the structure that we use when we are writing our answers, just to make sure we've included evidence and we've made sure our points are really, really clear. I've given you a couple of examples to help you before you write your own one. So in this first example at the top, the first bullet point, I've written an entire PEE for you. Let's have a quick look and make sure we understand which part is the point, which part is the evidence, which part is the explanation. So, one social cause of inequality is investment in healthcare and education. This is my point. So, is investment in healthcare and education. That is my point. I like that whole part. That's the point. That is telling me this is the cause of inequality. The cause of inequality is investment in healthcare and education. For example, Costa Rica spent much of its GNP on improving these services. So, for example, Costa Rica. Okay, that is my evidence. I'm giving an example of where in the world this has happened. I'm basically proving to the examiner that I'm not making this up and I've actually got some evidence for it. Okay, and then finally, my last little sentence here. As a result of this, the population of Costa Rica has a much higher quality of life than many of the nearby countries. So in that last sentence, I'm explaining how the investment in health and health and education has improved the country. I'm basically explaining why is it that this thing is a cause of inequality. Some good sentence starters to use as a result of this. This is because, this means that. Okay, so let's now do one. I'm now just going to do one for you and just show you how to do it. So one economic cause of inequality is, I'm going to put exploitation of natural resources. Okay, so natural resources is the economic cause of inequality that I'm going to choose. For example, in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, the country is an LIC despite its resources. Okay. Now, in my final sentence, I need to explain that point. I need to explain how have the natural resources caused inequality. So I'm going to choose "this is because." I think that's a nice, simple sentence starter. Okay. So I'm going to say, "This is because people in the country have fought over resources, causing conflict." Okay, so I've got my point, I've got my evidence, and I've got my explanation. I could, if I wanted to, if I was really going for it, I could also put another point in here for my explanation to explain about how Democratic Republic of Congo has also not got a fair price for the resources that it has. So point, evidence, explanation, and I would encourage you to use these sentence starters here to help you when you are doing your own examples. So what I want you to do now, there is an assignment for you which has this exam question. I simply want you to write me 2 more PEE paragraphs. So it's just 6 sentences, 3 sentences for each PEE to explain 2 more reasons why some countries are richer than others. Please make sure you email me if you have any questions. Please also make sure you just watch back in the video if you need any more help, if anything is not quite clear. Look forward to seeing you next week. Hope you have a good rest of the day.